Hi, my name is Stuart Lynch. In this video, I'd like to introduce you to 4 more text view formatters for dates introduced this year at WWDC 24. They can magically present your dates relative to or offset from other dates in a most natural presentation. And you'll also be introduced to the new TimeDataSource struct that can provide text views with dates and automatically continually update the values over time without you having to create a timer. I love getting your feedback, so if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment below. Make sure you ring the bell to enable notifications and get notified whenever a new video is released. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. A link is in the description. There is a starter project for this video, and you can download it from the link in the description. There are 2 branches, so make sure you download the starter branch for this project, as it has the starter resources. The completed branch contains the completed source code for the video. Just download and expand the zipped archive. The project does require Xcode 16, and at the time of this recording, I'm running Xcode 16 Beta 4. The starter project is created so that if you want to follow along, and I recommend that you do, in the end you'll have something that you can refer back to in the future. In order to simplify things and speed up the process, I've created an extension for date, and within there created a number of static properties that we can use in our code so you're not troubled with creating your own dates. I've also created a special date struct that contains a string for the name and the date that is one of those corresponding static dates. There's also a static array of all of these dates that we can use for our picker in the first case. The project itself is just a collection of views that progressively introduce you to the features of the new format styles available to you in iOS 18 and hopefully give you ideas on how you can introduce them into your own projects. This year at WWDC, we were introduced to 4 new text format styles by way of a new SystemFormatStyle enum. It has 4 new cases: date offset, date reference, stopwatch, and timer. And these new styles will allow us to compare a date to another and display that information in a text view using one of these different format styles. The first 2 that we're going to look at are the date reference and the date offset. So let's start with date reference. And I really recommend that you drill down on the documentation whenever you're learning something new in Swift. There is often invaluable information here. For example, the overview here tells us what the reference format is intended for, and it's for referring to a certain date in the most natural way possible. For example, if an event is 1 minute away, most people refer to it in a relative way, i.e. the event starts in 1 minute. However, if the dates are really far away, it becomes easier to refer to them in an absolute way. For example, the original iPhone was announced in January 2007. If we drill down on the initializer, we see that we need to provide a reference date to which we are comparing a date to, and there are 3 other parameters that have some default values already: allowed fields, max field count, and threshold field. And we'll come back to these in a minute, but the descriptions here are worth reading to help you in your understanding. In my first tab, for convenience sake, I've presented a list of all of our static dates as well as the current date, which is the date and time that I recorded the section of the video. Let me fold up this section in the view as it's not really relevant to what we're doing. In the next section, I have a label content view where the label is a picker and it's bound to a reference date property that is one of our special date objects. And I initialize it as the first one in the array, which is tomorrow. Now, the picker is going to allow us to choose any one of those dates. For the content of this section, I want to display a text view that displays the date reference format that compares the current date to the selected date in the picker. So let's do that. For the content in this first section, I want to display a text view that displays the current date, date.now, using the date reference format that's going to compare that current date to a selected date, which is going to be one of our picker dates. So we'll create that date using date.now. And for the format, I'll choose the reference case, and I'm just going to accept the default initializer that only asks us for the date, which is our reference date.date property. Well, you can see that as we select a different date from the picker, what gets displayed is a friendly description of how far that date is from the current date, but in some cases it's an absolute date because it's too far away. And the way that this information is displayed is dependent on those other three arguments. So what I want to do is to put those right here within our initializer and use the default so that nothing will change, and then adjust them to see how they affect our presentation. So let me use a Control-M to break this line up into multiple lines. Then let me return to the initializer. So for the allowed fields, I'm going to copy all that they have here, and I'm going to use that in my allowed fields argument for my format. And then I can add a max count of 2 to the threshold field and specify day. Now before I start changing these arguments, let's see what those three arguments do. For allowed fields, when a text view is displayed, these are all of the fields that are allowed to be used in our view, if they make any sense to be used. If they do not specify one of them, it won't be used in the presentation of the view. The max field count here, when the reference date is too far away from the current date to really make any sense, it uses not a relative phrase, but an absolute date. And this will be determined by how many of these allowed fields we allow to be displayed. And the threshold field will determine when you need to switch from a relative presentation to an absolute presentation. That's why, for example, in our view, we have the relative presentation when we compare not tomorrow, but when we switch to next month, we're showing the absolute date. And notice how the year is not displayed, because we are within the current year. But if we switch to the next new year, we're given the year as the absolute date, and the format decides whether or not it needs to display one or more of those other allowed fields. I encourage you to play around a bit. In the next view, we will explore this a little bit more and see what happens when the time between the two dates gets really small. For example, if I switch the threshold field to year, none of our dates become absolute. They're all relative. If I remove all of the allowed fields except for minute, you'll get the number of minutes in the relative presentation. Now, even though second was not one of the allowed fields, I can change minutes to seconds, and you'll see now that it gives us the number of seconds to each of those different target dates. Well, having both minutes and seconds will still only show minutes because for relative presentation, our closest reference date is tomorrow, and it doesn't really make any sense to present the seconds here. Again, we'll show you how this changes in the next view. I'm going to switch back to showing the default allowed fields, but I'm going to keep that threshold field to year. Well, offset is similar, but a different kind of format. Let's check the documentation and initializer for it. We see that it's used to display the offset to a certain date. So let's go to the initializer. This time there are 4 parameters. The anchor is the date that we want to determine the offset to. Allowed fields have these defaults. The max field count again with the same purpose, which we will explore further in the next section. And a sign, which determines if we want to show a negative sign if the offset is in the past. Now, before I return to the view, let me copy all these allowed fields to my clipboard. Now, back in my view, let's replace the content of the offset section with a text view displaying the current date with a format that displays the offset case to the selected preference date. And as before, I could have used the default values for allowed fields in the max field and the sign, but I want to explore. So I'm going to accept all parameters by holding the Command key down when I press return on the selection. The offset is to the reference dates.date property. The allowed fields I can just paste in from what I copied. max field count was 2, and the sign I'm going to leave it automatic. You can see the difference here between reference from now and offset from now. The offset is a negative number because the current date is earlier than tomorrow. Plus, it gives you hours and minutes. Let me choose yesterday. You'll see it gets a positive number. If we choose next new year, it just gives us a month because it's too far away to give us any more granular detail. Offset doesn't have a threshold, so you'll never be presented with an absolute date. If you remove all but hours and minutes and seconds, however, you'll be presented with hours and minutes only, so why not seconds? And that's because we're displaying a max field count of 2. If I change it to a 3, I get a different display. It's displaying the number of hours, minutes, and seconds for all cases. So let me return to something a little more reasonable. Before I show you the other 2 format styles, I want to show you one more thing that was introduced in WWDC 24, and that's the new TimeDataSource. As you can see from the documentation, it's a struct that can provide the text view with live and automatically update values in widgets, activities, and in our apps. And it has one static property that I want to show you here, and that's the current date. So let's see how we can use that. Back in the TimeDataSource view here, let's create a new constant, and we're going to call that now, and is a type TimeDataSource of type date, and I'm going to initialize it with the current date static property. Well, in the digital clock section, I want to display that property in a text view, and I'm going to use datetime format to display the content. So it's a text view displaying now with the format datetime. And when I do that, it appears just like a static text view. However, let's add some more granularity here by formatting it by adding the hour, minute, and second. And now we see that we have an actual clock that is stepping through by seconds. And we can make this more into a better digital clock by applying a large title font. I can make it bold. And then so that the digits don't jump around, I'm going to provide it with a modifier that's a monospaced digit. Great. Now our view is always displaying the current time. Of course, you could change this to display your own date time format if you like. Well, now that we have a date that is always changing, let's explore that reference format a little further. First, for reference then, let me create a property called future date that will be date.now by adding a time interval of 70 million seconds. Now this will be a fixed date when the view appears, and it'll never change until the view gets updated. But our now date is constantly changing. So our now date changes, we can use our reference format to see how that text presentation changes over time. So we're going to prevent that now using the format reference. And again, I'm going to hold down the command key and press return to get all arguments. The reference will be to the future date. For allowed fields, I'm going to specify everything: year, month, day, hour, minute, and second. And I'm going to specify a max field count of 3. And for my threshold, I'm going to specify the year. You can see that as I start removing zeros, that relative display changes, each time providing me with a different relative presentation. If I get down to 7, I see the seconds are ticking away. This might be a nice way if in your app you are wanting to display an active countdown until a particular event is reached. Let's try the offset as well in this next section. So let's create a date that's in the past. So I'm going to call it last mistake. And since it's in the past, we can use that 70 million again, but let's make it negative. Then we can create a text view using our TimeDataSource constant now. And the format is the offset. And let's use that command return to get all of our different options. The offset is going to be to the last mistake. And for the allowed fields, let's just copy the ones that we had in the future date reference. But let's up the max field count to 6 so that we'll be able to see the seconds by second countdown. And we'll add an automatic sign. Nice. There hasn't been a mistake in over 2 years and 2 months. This might be a bit too granular, so I could remove some of those allowed fields. However, as we start reducing the time interval, we might make sense to keep them. In a real-world situation, let's say your app wants to display the number of days of uptime or since the last workplace injury. In that case, you might want to specify allowed fields to be the year, month, and day, but also add a week. And then you can set the max field count to 4. In this last view, I want to look at the other 2 format options that we have, and they are the timer and stopwatch cases. First thing I want to do is to have a reference to the current time in this view. So I'm just going to copy the now property from the previous view. And I'm also going to copy that digital clock view and use it here. Now, we're going to want to be able to set a timer in the action for this button. Now, I don't want the timer to start immediately, but rather sometime in the future, and then stop sometime further down in the future. So this will give us a range that we can use for our timer format. Now, since this will not be set ahead of time, I'm going to create a start and stop property as optional state properties here in the view, so that when I tap on the button, I can actually set those values. So let's start with a state property called start. As I said, it's an optional date. And then another state property called end. It's another optional date. And then the range then can be another optional range of date, and it can be a computed property. So if we unwrap start and end using if let start, let end, we can return start up to but not including end as our range. If start and end or either one of them are optional, we'll just return nil. So then in our button action, we can set some start and end times in the future. And we're just going to make sure that the end is later than the start. For the start, let's set it to a date that is, say, 10 seconds after we press the start button. And then for the end, let's make it 15 seconds later, so at 24. And then in the section for time then, let's display the start and end times first for the timer. And I'm going to do this in a group. So I'm going to create a group, and I'm going to apply a font of title to the group. And I'm going to set the frame to be a width of 300. So anything within the group is going to have those modifiers. Now within that group, I can only display content if start and end are not optional. So I'm going to surround the entire group with an if let start, let end. Then within the group, then we can use labeled content to display our content. So I'm going to use a string starts at, and then for the content, I'm going to use a text view using that start property. And for the format, I'm going to use the date time format, but also specify hour, minute, and second. So now I'm going to be able to see what that start time is. And I'm going to just reuse this same content here for the labeled content, and I'm going to specify that the NZAT is going to display a text view using the end with the same format. Below that group, if we have a range, we can display our counting now variable using this new timer format. So first, let's check to see if range is actually non-optional using an if let. And then I'm going to create another group in here so that we can apply common modifiers to both of the options that we want to create. So within that group, I'm going to create a text view displaying the now variable where the format is a timer. And I see that I have two options, one for counting up, in, or counting down in within a range. So I'm going to start with counting down in and just use the default arguments. Below that, though, I'm going to create another text view with now, but the format this time is going to be the timer using counting up, in, and I'll hold the command key down to get all of the other arguments. The range, as in the first case, is going to be our range. We can say that show hours is false because our range is going to be short. Let's choose a max field count of 3. And I can set a precision to microseconds of 10. And then I can apply a font of large title and bold and monospace digits to both. So let's tap on the button to see if it works. Well, this should be working. But remember, I'm still on beta here. I don't see anything wrong with my code, so let me just stop and start the preview. Now let me try again. That's better. When we click on the timer button, we see our projected start and end times and two static text timers. One starting at 0, wanting to count up, and the other starting at 15, wanting to count down. And after clicking the button, nothing happens though for the first 10 seconds until that start time is reached. And then one counts up and the other counts down. So you can play with that start and end times and verify the start and ending by comparing those two dates to the current date. And then the final new format option is the stopwatch format. So for this, we'll create an optional stopwatch date property that we'll set in the action for the start button. So it's an optional stopwatch start, optional date. The action then will set that date to, say, date.now, which means that whenever we tap on the start button, the timer is going to start. Below the button, I'll create a condition using an if-let stopwatch to make sure that it's no longer optional. And then inside the conditional, I'm going to create a text view displaying our now constant. And the format is going to be set to the stopwatch format. Again, I will use the command enter to get all fields and a control M to separate them onto different lines. Starting at will be our stopwatch start time. We can say show hours to true. I'll set the maximum field count to 3 and the max precision to the microseconds F10. And then I'll set the text view to have a large title font. I'll make it bold and monospace digits again. Now when I tap on the button, a timer starts counting up. And it never stops. And it's also independent of the other views using that now property. You can play around the max field count to see how the view is displayed. There is no need to have that start to be date.now. We could specify an earlier or a later start time. For example, let's use yesterday as the start time. Now when I tap on the start button, it picks up from the start time and continues on. Well, that's it for this video, and I hope you've learned something new that you can use in your projects going forward. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment below. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and enable notifications so that you are made aware of new videos that I release. And you can also download my free channel listing app to be able to search for and find content from any one of my over 300 Swift and SwiftUI related videos. Thanks for watching.